My name is Nicole Donaldson. I'm the Vice President of Philanthropic Strategies and Partnerships at the Central Florida Foundation, and we're thrilled to have everyone here today. Today we are going to be discussing the role of philanthropy in disasters. It's part of a four-part series that we're doing with the role of philanthropy in. Last segment we did was on journalism, and today we have a wonderful group of panelists with expertise in this topic, which is very timely and something that we hope that can be an evergreen resource to come back to. Just a couple of housekeeping items. This call is being recorded and it will be made available for viewing after. If you have any questions for our panelists along the way, please feel free to utilize the Q&A. You can type in your questions there, and we'll do our best to try and respond to some of these questions towards the end of our discussion. I do want to also mention that if you are not already aware, Central Florida Foundation is implementing Table Talk on October 19th. So we would love for you to check that out and participate. We'll be sure to enter that information for you to view of where to go on that as well. For now, I would like to hand it over to our President and CEO, Mark Brewer.
Thank you, Nicole, and good morning, everyone. It seems only appropriate that in Florida, we'd be having a discussion about philanthropy's role in disasters, specifically climate-related disasters, as we are more than halfway through the season now, but we still have to get to the end of November. So we have a little time ahead of us. And I'm happy to have a great panel here to talk about philanthropy's role in disasters, climate disasters specifically today. And so let me introduce you to the panel. He is the Chief Administrator in the Office of Emergency Management at Seminole County. He's worked in emergency services for more than 25 years, including internationally, which has resulted in managing a range of disasters, both natural and man-made. He also teaches Federal Emergency Management Agency and Department of Homeland Security courses. Please help me welcome Alan Harris. Good morning, Al.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
She's the president and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. She has more than 25 years of experience in international humanitarian policy and practice, and throughout her career has focused on improving the effectiveness and impact of this aid sector. Say hello this morning to Patty McIlreavy. Good morning, Patty.
Hello, good morning, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here. She's the executive director of the American Red Cross Central Florida and U.S. Virgin Islands. She brings extensive experience, including crisis management and leadership, and has seen firsthand the devastating impact on families and communities from disasters across the country and right here in Central Florida. Join me in welcoming Janice Moran. Hi, Janice.
Hello, thank you so much.
Good to have you here. And she is a Miami native who serves as Collective Impact Officer for the Miami Foundation. She oversees the Miami Foundation's Climate and Disaster Portfolio as part of that organization's Collective Impact Department. She's responsible for leading large-scale change through cross-sector collaboration by bringing together government, philanthropy, nonprofits, and corporations to solve major climate and disaster planning challenges. Join me in saying hello to Faith Grant. Good morning, Faith.
Hi, good morning, Mark. Thank you so much for having me.
It's good to have you all here this morning. I want to start with you, Alan, around something that you also have a connection to, this cross-sector piece that we all recognize as an important part of disaster work. You also have the ability to share with us a little bit of information on Seminole Heart, which is this kind of cross-collaboration across sectors that has a really unique approach to disaster management.
Yeah, so Seminole Heart is a 501c3, but it is a collaborative. It is an organization, we call it a long-term recovery committee. Sometimes in the country, it's called a long-term recovery group. But we were formed back in 1998 after the worst tornado strike in recorded history here in the state of Florida. This organization brings together nonprofits, faith organizations, and of course government to work together to meet the needs of the community. After a disaster, of course, FEMA comes in, the Small Business Administration. There are a couple of governmental programs, the Community Development Block Grant, other types of grant programs, but sometimes, many times, our most socially vulnerable are caught in between. They get a little bit of money from FEMA, but it doesn't quite fix the home. They don't have the resources or the support to go maybe even and apply. They have language barriers, and they can't get through those language barriers to do the right application or find the right means for connectivity to whatever their issue is. So we bridge that gap at Seminole Heart. So I am, of course, the director over here, chief administrator of the Office of Emergency Management, but I also take that hat off and then put the other hat on, and I'm the co-chair of Seminole Heart, which is a nonprofit, again, that brings those organizations together to support those individuals. And we've been doing it for many, many years. And as you mentioned, even in Haiti after the earthquake, we were doing those types of activities. So not just here in Seminole County, but people coming to the area as well.
Great, that's helpful. Listen, we have almost 30 years of experience in disaster funding at the Central Florida Foundation, and it's complicated for both funders and donors to figure out where they're supposed to step in, right? So there's a retail segment of the community that wants to drop right now whatever they can in the form of resources to help people. But there is a kind of a triage that has to happen after a disaster. And Patty, I know that you advise funders and philanthropists around the country in how to make investments after disasters. What's that protocol look like?
It's a great question. And I really want to highlight, I think this is wonderful that you guys are doing this series of how philanthropy can help in these different areas, because they are interconnected, right? We know that people give in disasters because of three reasons, right? Proximity, scale, and media. And so how media tells that story, how they lift up the recovery needs instead of just focusing on the disaster and the event itself, can help drive solutions in a way that is just, we're behind the times on. We really need to be exploring, like as Alan said, disasters are created by events meeting vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities are not created by that disaster. They're societal and they're economical, and they've been created by ourselves. And how we approach that is really important, but it also means we have to tell the story differently. We need to really challenge ourselves about getting beyond the event. And so when we look at how do we help donors, we remind them of that. We remind them of centering humanity, of centering the dignity and agency of the communities. That if you're really looking for the long-term solution for this community that you care about, you need to listen to that community. You need to find a solution they are focused on. I mean, you started off by saying, I have over 25 years operational experience. I do. And you know what? I don't know every solution. I am not part of every community. I have to listen and find the solutions. My team finds the solutions with them, because it's so contextual. It's challenging based on why they have the vulnerabilities. So one is really about that, is trying to remind philanthropy to center that humanity, to keep that in place. It's also, we advise them to have a strategy. If they're very, there's a lot, climate change, other factors, disasters are coming more and more. The scale is increasing. And we need to have people taking a moment to have clarity on when will I give, how will I give, and be more thoughtful in that process, because it will also help you manage your own emotions and your own connectivity to those disasters and to those communities. So having that strategy is really clear for us. And some part of that strategy is finding the organizations you want to support. Who's aligned to your mission? Who does work in an equitable recovery mindset and can help you? And that's where organizations like CDP come in, but others who are there community foundations, others that you work with that you want to automatically have during those blue sky times, those relationships, those arrangements that you know how to give. And so what we always say to people is pull away from the reactive. Disasters by definition create this reactive emotion. We want people to be proactive, to take a moment and think through, I know there are going to be ways that I have to give in disasters, that I'm going to give in disasters, that I wish to give in disasters. How do I proactively plan for that so that I'm not just reactive and responsive to the drivers of proximity, scale, and media, but actually proactive to my desire for recovery, equity, and centering humanity and dignity?
Great points. Every disaster we've ever been through starts with this entrepreneurial kind of process where you're gathering together people to identify what are the needs, what are the resources available, where's philanthropy's role in that process, and to try to restrain from the immediate, let's do something today, to people rather than for them. So that's important stuff. Janice, you're on the front lines of this in every disaster. This is part of what the Red Cross does. What's your perspective on this?
You know, it's one of the, because as it's already been stated, the intensity of our disasters, we used to have an off season in between our disasters, and we don't anymore, right? That was our catch-up time. That was a time for us to take a breath and plan out the rest of the year, and we don't have that anymore. None of us have that anymore, and we worry about, of course, of donor fatigue, right? And we've just kind of taken that approach of educating our donors about what we're doing, keeping them informed, as well as just maintaining those relationships, right? So they're transformational, not transactional, and just keeping them abreast of what's going on, having those conversations of what their interests are. Why with the Red Cross, and just really get to know them and deepen those relationships so that we can, instead of, holding out our hands, so to speak, and making the ask, it's a true relationship and we can have those honest conversations.
Your challenge is, I'm always aware of your challenge of trying to keep resources in place for the coming disaster, for which no one's interested because it hasn't happened yet. And then immediately after the disaster, needing to raise money quickly in order to try to solve for those complex issues that you have to deal with. Faith, I'm assuming that you, like us, spend time on both sides of this equation. We spend as much time talking about climate-related issues as we do the disasters that come from climate-related issues. Tell me about the portfolio that you manage in Miami and how you folks look at it.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. So for the first time ever, Miami came together and created what we know of as the Miami Disaster Resilience Fund. And so this fund was created in collaboration with public and private philanthropists and champions within our community to have a bulk of money readily available at the start of the hurricane season. And it is designed in 3 specific ways. One way it's designed is that we focus on preparedness. And so what that looks like is about 4 to 6 weeks ahead of hurricane season, we're on the ground, we're having discovery sessions, we're listening to nonprofits. And so right at the beginning of that hurricane season, we have a pot of money that we distribute. We have the same for relief. As soon as there's a major storm that hits, we are responding and distributing money either ahead of landing or as soon as 24 hours after. And then for long-term resilience, we also have a pot of money for that as well. And so what I do is I not only manage the relationships between our nonprofits, but we also have to think about how our government steps in this place. Like, how are we collaborating in a way that we're preparing people for the hurricane season? As Janice said, there is no off season anymore. So how do we continue carrying this message? And so that fund is developed for that we are able to identify the resources, the needs, and get them in the hands of our nonprofit community members. And as far as climate, we all know kind of Miami is the epicenter, or one of the epicenters of climate and disaster. And so there's nowhere we can turn where we can ignore it. And so in partnership, the Miami Foundation partnered with 3 of our major cities, and we have able to develop a strategy, 59 action steps. That sounds great, but how do we progress and track those 59 action steps? How are we able to, although they are solvable solutions that have been contributed by a wide range of partners within our ecosystem, how are we ensuring that these steps are getting us closer to a more resilient community? And so I also manage how that comes to fruition, how we reach our goals within that climate portfolio.
Yeah, it's always challenging when you're not in the middle of a climate disaster. You do a plan and it has steps to it, and then the disaster happens, and everyone's like their hair's on fire. Now we have to go do something right away, and it's easy to forget 5 of the first 59 steps as you work into it. So it really does take organization to make that happen. Alan, I'm interested in clearly the public sector and the nonprofit sector and the private sector are all 3 partners after a disaster. The public sector kind of gets the first glance, not only because of funding, but also because of FEMA and other resources that become available immediately after a disaster. Talk to us a little bit about the partnership that Seminole County has with the other 2 sectors in how you work immediately after a disaster. Is there a plan or a strategy in place?
Yeah, so the county, and it's pretty consistent across the Central Florida area, really across the state of Florida. The county is focused primarily on infrastructure, getting those main thoroughfares up and running, our critical infrastructures like water, power, healthcare, those types of services back operational as quickly as possible. Simultaneously, we're trying to help the community, of course, bounce back. And the way we do that, I think every government emergency manager would love to go on personal property and help people fix their homes, but government simply just cannot do that. We rely completely on FEMA for one, other grants that come through HUD and other programs, USDA. There's lots of different grant programs. And then all these unmet needs, these individuals in our community that have expressed some type of need, low fixed income communities, senior communities, language barriers, persons with disabilities, all different types of situations, transportation disadvantaged individuals, and how we link those people with the public grant programs. Now, when that happens, of course, oftentimes those don't meet. So the grant program that FEMA is not going to make you whole. It's absolutely not. It's going to give you a little money to get you on your feet a little bit. So there's often these huge gaps. Just in the last hurricane, Hurricane Ian, our last federally declared disaster, we have Seminole Heart, our volunteer organizations assisting in disaster. Our long-term recovery committee has done over 174,000 hours of volunteer work. That's repairing roofs, that's fixing drywall, lots of flood muck outs, mold remediation, things like that. That's that gap. So they may get a little money for a grant from a grant program, but there's a huge gap in what it really costs and what that grant offered to them. So that's where these partnerships, these interfaith, these nonprofit organizations, American Red Cross being a huge partner with us, as well as many other agencies, we have to bridge that gap, help those individuals that, they're living paycheck to paycheck. They can't fix up their home. And the reason for that is because we know there's a Hurricane Idalia coming. And that's exactly what happened this year. So Hurricane Idalia is coming to the state of Florida. There's still blue tarps on roof. There's still people living in FEMA trailers out in front of their home. So those individuals are now at more risk. So we're trying to help those individuals get back into their homes, fortify their homes, make their homes more strong or more resilient, so that we do not have to continue to go through this over and over again. And then there's mitigation grants as well that are available. So we're elevating homes. We're buying out people's homes. So people that have bought homes in flood-prone areas that have been flooded in 2008 during Tropical Storm Faye, in 2017 during Irma, and now again during Ian. That's raising all of our insurance rates. It's costing them a lot mentally, emotionally, and financially. So we're trying to offer to them, move out of that. Let's return that to the floodplain, which is where it should have been anyways. And a lot of people are taking us up on it. So there's a lot of different programs, and it's just making sure that all those programs are connected. And that's really what we try to do in the Office of Emergency Management is network and connect everything so no one is left behind. We want to make sure that we're equitable to every single person in the county, from from the individual, again, with a disability to a language barrier to whatever.
And I'll just add to that we actually have great collaboration across all 7 of the Central Florida counties. And in fact, there is a plan in place post-disaster where nonprofits who are in the space come together and have taken responsibility for certain things, so that we kind of try to not get in each other's way in that process. But that's an important point. And all that you said, Alan, leads me to this question of fatigue. And Patty, I'm gonna aim this first at you, and then I want to hear from Janice on this. But fatigue is a big issue after storms, especially after you get 3 or 4 storms. And because we're on a railroad of storms every year, how do you deal with fatigue?
Well, that's such a great question, Mark. And I think, I feel one is we have to recognize that philanthropy is generous. They have been incredibly generous, and we have to thank people for their giving. We look at the numbers of overarching philanthropy. It's about $500 billion in the U.S. every year, according to Indiana University, but only $5 billion of that goes into disasters. And even, a very small percentage of that goes into recovery. So when we talk about fatigue, I think one is we also need to keep in mind that what is the fatigue? Is it donor fatigue? Because donors have shown they have the money. They've shown that they can be generous. And I think we often focus on the individual and we say, oh, there's economic, crisis in the United States. And so that individual can't give. But there's other sources of giving. There's other ways that people give. And communities are the #1 givers to their own communities. So, I think one is, I think we need to sometimes pull off that language of the fatigue in it being about the money. Because I actually think what the fatigue is about the empathy. We are being asked to care nonstop nowadays about everything. And people are tired. We talk, there's a crisis of mental health post-COVID. There's empathy overload. We're pulled in many, many ways. And yes, one demonstration of empathy is writing a check, but there's other ways to help as well. And I think for me, we have to get better at capturing the different ways donors can help, because they can give their time. They can give their attention. They can lift up issues, a dinner party. They can talk about what's going on in Sudan or what's going on in their neighborhood or what's going on anywhere. It's about bringing attention to these areas and motivating others to care and give as well. And I think for too long, we've kind of tied it to, caring equals dollars, and caring is actually, it's a heavier lift than that. And what we ask of people is more than that. And so, yes, of course, the dollars are welcome. I'm not in any way saying we're not supportive of those who want to write checks and help out in their neighborhoods and give in different ways. But for me, the fatigue that's coming in is because it's one story after another. It's needs after needs after needs. And I would put it a little bit on ourselves, the nonprofit community as well. We need to tell that story better. We need to celebrate the wins. We need to talk about the recovery that's happened. Alan's given a couple of examples of programming they're doing that actually is lifting up that community and helping them have a better future. We need to be able to elevate some of that so that people can actually see it's not always more into crisis, but actually an investment in common humanity. And if we can find a way to bring that messaging forward more, I think it'll be more motivating. I don't know about you, but I don't give because people tell me there's not enough money. I give because people tell me there are needs, and I connect with those needs, and I connect with those communities. And we need to move to that space in a stronger, more deliberate, proactive way. And I think there's a lot of organizations such as Center for Disaster Philanthropy that's trying to work on that, that's trying to tell the real story, that's looking at the realities. White people in this country get financially, not every other factor, financially wealthier after a disaster hits them versus marginalized or racialized communities in this country. That's a problem. And that isn't resolved by fatigue. That's resolved through open conversations about the inequities that create the vulnerabilities that have caused those problems to exist and those communities to be extra exposed. And if we can look at that, it's not only upon the disaster philanthropist to resolve the issues. It's not only upon those who are looking to give as a result of the disaster. It's actually all those development actors, everyone doing community work, social justice work, racial justice work. We need to join hands. This is a situation all of us are needed in together. It's an ecosystem problem. And the solution is that same ecosystem working in better concert and recognizing that we all have a part to play. And if we look at it in that way, the fatigue is less relevant because actually there's a huge amount of money going into philanthropy in this country. It's actually increasing from year to year. And so that then allows us to look at that bigger pot of money and say, actually, how do we help all together? How do we not need as much to go in after a disaster for recovery? Because you know what? Not as many people were harmed.
Good points. We aim most of our philanthropy at second stage, not at response, but in recovery, which encompasses all the things you talked about. And there is no lack of money for that activity. In fact, that gets the strategic mind of many people focused on things that have broader impact in the community, not just the recovery from a disaster. So Janice, I want to talk about fatigue at the front lines. Organizations like yours who are there after every storm, how do you deal with that fatigue?
Are you talking about the emotional side of it? We really, I'm going to use Hawaii wildfires as an example. We do have volunteers that have rotated to Hawaii. And I want to say that talking with them, that's one of the most difficult operations. And these are seasoned volunteers, right? They're our disaster response warriors, right? And it has taken a tremendous toll on them. We have disaster mental health for our clients. That's one of the things that we do offer. But let it be known, it's for our disaster workers as well, right? Paid or unpaid staff. And we have those resources available, and they are being utilized, I think, more over the last couple of years than historically. So we do band together. We keep an open door policy. Let's talk about it. Let's get these resources. Here's some of our partners, right? And talk with them as well. Making sure we have, those resources and being very well educated. If you're talking about fatigue, just literal physical fatigue, that's there too. And it's that capacity building. We're constantly building our capacity so that we have commitments. For instance, with Seminole County, we have commitments, and we must honor them. And we're good right now. But if we have more and more disasters, especially more in the Florida area, we constantly need to be building that capacity. And it's not just for the local disasters, it is for these national disasters. And because we are there longer, we're not just there for 3 or 4 weeks, we're there for months at a time. And depending on the generosity of our donors for that particular disaster, if they're designated dollars for that disaster, we'll have our long-term recovery group set up, and it is where we can actually provide grants to the local organizations and the small businesses and nonprofits, so that we can continue to build that resiliency, that recovery section, but also that resiliency, because that is key, right? It's that preparedness and that education, and to our communities, to our donors, just in every conversation with our preparedness programs and how to prepare, and making sure that, like I said, educating our disaster workers, right? And there's training across the board with psychological first aid to actually working in a shelter, or damage assessment, because we have, like Alan was saying, we have our partners, we have our government partners. We are not a government agency, but we do work closely with the federal government and the different agencies. So so that we can share that damage assessment information with our government partners. And it just goes on and on and on. So yes, it does. There is fatigue.
There is fatigue, right? Faith And Alan, I want you to both talk about this a minute. You first, Faith. We've talked a little bit about the long-term impact of philanthropy and the fact that you have to be thinking about this after the fact, and you've structured your system there to think about longer-term recovery. What does that look like, and how long?
That's a great question. And to be fully transparent, that's a question that we continuously ask ourselves. Like, how are we actually structuring ourselves for long-term recovery, years plus? Like, what is the investment that we have to make within our community, whether it's like relationship building or making sure that our residents have certain understandings and educations to what would be required, but also us as philanthropists, how are we collaborating with other foundations across the state to understand like what this long-term recovery actually will require of us? We know that there's essential needs. We know that there will be restructuring and rebuilding, but what does that specifically take? That's something that we grapple with. Besides just having the funds to do it, throwing money at people is never the answer, right? How do we continuously and strategically build a structure for ourselves and people throughout Miami and Florida to be able to have resilience plans? And so that's something we're still discovering, and we're open and willing to continue to learn and collaborate with other partners that are actually doing this work and have experienced long-time recovery.
I think we see every storm has a different tale, right? In some cases, it's immediate damage, and response sometimes handles recovery, right? If you get the roofs back on, get everybody back in their houses, things are fine. But many storms have very long tails on them. And certainly other kinds of disasters, in our case, shooting disasters and other kinds of disasters, which may have a 15 or 20-year tail, where we're still funding mental health years after the event happened. Because it doesn't stop. Alan, when you look long term from a public sector seat, what does that look like past recovery, and what kind of partnership do you need past recovery to make that happen?
Sure. So recovery is the longest phase of the disaster cycle, if you will. Preparedness, response, mitigation, and recovery. And recovery can last for years. Governmental recovery through reimbursement from disaster funds, as well as individuals. There are people still in our community that when a severe thunderstorm rolls through, they go all the way back to 1998, and when the tornadoes ripped through Midway and so many people died and their homes were destroyed, and they still talk about that today. So the mental health, as you mentioned, the Pulse nightclub event that happened in downtown, that is going to be on any LGBT persons that was in this community at that time, and really across the nation. When they go into any nightclub, when they go into any safe space, in the back of their mind, they're thinking about exits, and they're thinking about, I mean, there is a mental health component to all of these floods, tornadoes, wildfires, all of these types of things. So there is a mental health component and helping those individuals to get the assistance that they need. And then there is building back, and we talked about building back the roofs. Do we want to build the roofs back the way they were, or do we want to build them stronger? And our focus is to build them stronger. Let's make our community more resilient. If we continue to flood in the same area, let's fix the storm systems. Let's make the storm systems better. If this home continues to flood, let's either elevate it out of the floodplain, let's put it above the base flood elevation, or, like I mentioned, buy them out, because we can't afford in Florida for any more insurance companies to leave this state. And if we continue to put the burden on the insurance companies to bail us out over and over and over and over again and rebuild the homes exactly like they were before, they're going to leave. So we need to help ourselves too, of course, lower our insurance and then get those insurance companies back and move the people that are in these dangerous spots. And that's going to be difficult because we're in Florida. People like to be, they like to have their house look on a lake. They like to have their house look out on water. Well, if you live by a water source, chances are there's the potential you could flood. And so those discussions have to happen as we help these people to rebuild.
So that's a question, Faith, that I think is one I'd love to hear from you on, because as insurance companies begin to take control of this question, choosing not to rebuild in places or choosing not to insure at all, South Florida is kind of in the bullseye of that. What's that look like for you?
It is the reality, right? And for us, we understand that it is here and it is going to continue to get worse. So it is just a reality that we're facing. Currently, we had the opportunity with Miami-Dade County to partner with a different insurance company to focus on finding about 5 different solutions or creating insurance products for our most vulnerable communities. So we are currently in this fellowship and partnership because we've identified that not only do we have residents that are already vulnerable, that are already in challenging times, but now stripping away insurance and making their life even more difficult. What is our responsibility? What is our capacity? How can we meet the times? And so we are working on this partnership in collaboration with a local government to identify what's possible.
It's hard not to be on the water in South Florida, right?
It is very hard.
I had a horrifying conversation with a bank executive over lunch recently, in which he told me that the Miami branches, the South Florida branches, are moving as quickly as they can toward 15-year mortgages, because 30-year mortgages are a little chancy. That's kind of frightening, right?
Yeah.
I think that says something. I want to turn to a question now for all of you around, because this is something that clearly, if you're in this, you know how much work goes on. But if you're not in this, if you're on the side of wanting to try to help, the question always comes up, how are these funds being managed? How do we know for sure that they're going to do the right things? How do people know when they give money to whoever they give money to that it's going to be used in the appropriate way? And that's a retail question, right? So that's mostly people who are not very engaged. They give, and then they just go, I wonder what happened to my money. But I'd love to hear from all of you, just your point of view around how that works. Clearly, Janice, you're on the front lines of that and get direct contributions. But Faith, you and the Miami Foundation, as we in Central Florida, bring together lots of philanthropy around these events, and they have to have accountability around them. And Patty, I'm sure you hear this from time to time. So I'm interested in any of you giving us a hint of what you think about that.
I'm happy to go first from the broader outside of Florida perspective, because we do funds for, it's a service we offer to philanthropy, right? They believe in equity, they believe in community-led solutions, but not everybody has the time to research those smaller organizations, to find those smaller organizations and to invest in them and to support them. And that's where CDP can play a role. And yeah, I mean, in terms of how we do it, well, one is, there's the usual answer, like use Charity Navigator, use GuideStar, use the BBB, look for the organizations that have a strong reputation. And to be honest, I worked part of my career in a very large NGO. I'm not against large international NGOs or national NGOs, but I also think that those smaller ones, they often are the most in need in these crises. They're the ones who are going to be there alongside that community for that long haul. And so to find them, and if you can't find them, go to organizations who will find them, such as CDP and other intermediaries. What do we do that you can trust us? Well, there's of course the ratings that we have that show that we've been vetted and trusted, but I think also you can ask us and we're happy to talk about it. Our team does, they have very strong relationships with nonprofits, especially in areas where there's cyclical crises. We have long-term relationships. For example, post-Hurricane Harvey, those same organizations we helped in Texas then became grantee partners for COVID, now became grantee partners for the winter storms there. So, right, so working with those same organizations who have that connection with their community and investing in them. The visioning exercise my team does, the directors there, it's really outstanding. They spend a lot of time listening to community actors, community foundations, those who are operational on the ground, and learning what is it that's needed. How are the most vulnerable their needs being addressed? And if they're not, what are the gaps? Where can we make a difference? We don't have, the largest amount of funding as others, but we can make a difference. We know that often those gap fundings can be the difference for an entire community. And so how do we get there? And how do we use our money in that best way possible? And then we do due diligence. We basically, you entrust us as a donor to actually make sure that those we're giving funding to will make sure that they are vetted, that we'll do that search that you would have done on your own if you were looking at them as a partner. And then we build that partnership, as I said, for the long term. We're not one and done. We want to actually ensure that these communities know that they can continue to reach out to us and support them and work with them. And I think you'll find that with a lot of the different intermediary organizations, but it is about building that trust. It is about looking beyond that initial advertisement of those large organizations and how they may go in those early days. Yes, they have the ability to be, their capacity is very strong and they can respond very, very rapidly. But that longer haul, you want to look for organizations that have chapters in those communities, right? So they may be a big one, but they have chapters in those communities, such as Janice with the American Red Cross and all the spaces that they have, but who also have long-term trust of that community, because you want to have that so critical. The community needs to feel that the solution is really defined by them and designed by them and in step with them. And that's where that recovery side, it's just critical. If you have people coming in from outside telling you they know what you need, regardless of how much money they have, it's unlikely to be the solutions that community requires.
So Faith, on and literally to Patty's point, we many times are bringing together pools of capital that have strategy tied to them. And so that's the accountability. The retail donor doesn't always get to see that, right? They're throwing money into a big pot in hopes that something happens. How do you deal with that in Miami?
Yeah, so for us, and Patty hinted on this a lot, it's about our due diligence of making sure that donors know, one, they can trust us. They know that once a disaster hits, whether it's through Florida or somewhere in the Caribbean, we have a list of valuable and valid actual organizations that they can trust and donate to. We also have an open door and partnerships established in different areas in the Caribbean. And so they know that once we're able to share resources, that they can trust where their money is going. But two, I think that's also most important to me is just telling the story of giving. Like after they've donated the money, it's like, yes, I did that. I'm going to help them. But like, how are we sharing and communicating the impact of every single dollar after a storm? What kind of communication or media, like how are we able to highlight our donors, but also give a humanness to like what it actually means to just open your wallet and give to someone, like what that impact means for me and for us in Miami. It's a focal point because we want it to be a natural thing. We want people to understand that there is power within the intention of just knowing that there's a way that you can help. And so how can we elevate that sacrifice that you made, or how can we continue a partnership or a relationship where you realize that there's opportunities not just after a hurricane, but throughout your city, throughout your state, where we can give and help each other solve these problems within our community.
Janice, I assume you get this question often from people who want to know, how are you spending the money and how do I know you're doing the right things with it? How do you respond to that?
Well, it's funny. I cannot believe that we already just released. In fact, I haven't even had a chance to read it yet because I think it was yesterday, the Hurricane Ian 1-year annual report, right, wow, on what we did. So that's one of the ways. And we'll have several of those over the next few years, especially for Ian. It's again, it's having those conversations. It's, we're transparent, everything's on our website, but if there's anything specific, we definitely honor donors' intent. So if they specifically state they want it to go to Hurricane Idalia response, that's where the bucket of money, that's where it goes, and it stays in that bucket and will be used only for that. Because of all of the large disasters that we have now and funding for them, we're really talking more about donating to where it's needed most so that those donor dollars are not tied up in one disaster And then next week, there's one that's actually larger, but because of media fatigue, maybe with coverage, right? We're not going to get those same donor dollars. So it's just more beneficial. But we honor donor intent. We will have those conversations. We periodically put out information about how an infographic of sorts of, how many meals we've served and how many people have stayed in our shelters and what have you. We're here to answer any questions that anyone has. Yes, we are, like she said, we are a large national organization, but we are a local chapter and we are part of the community. I have had a conversation when I first joined in this position quite a number of years ago. There was an elected official in another county and said, we take care of our own. We're local. We take care of our own. And it's like, we are local as well. We live here too, right? So explaining all that. And it's just being open and honest and building that trust.
So we've touched on it a couple of times during the conversation, and you really hit it, Janice, this issue of media fatigue, because I think it's there. I'd love for all of you to just weigh in on what would you recommend the media not do the next time there's a storm? Because from watching it come off the coast of Africa till the time it's right outside the front door here, it's constant top end coverage of things that most people don't even understand. But what do you wish the media wouldn't do when they're covering storm disasters?
Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah. I thought I was going to let you speak, Jess. So I'll speak of the philanthropy as far as the disaster within the disaster, and I know anyone that is here has experienced it. It was experienced in Hurricane Idalia just recently in the Big Bend. We sent some folks up. It happened here in Hurricane Ian. It happened after the earthquake in Port-au-Prince. And that is people meaning very well, donating items and shipping it.
Right.
Yes.
It is an incredible burden on the local government, as well as our nonprofit organizations, to try to sort those, get those to where people, I mean, the horrific pictures from Superstorm Sandy, where they just basically took it to the landfill. These well-meaning people went into their garages, their closets, whatever, and pulled out nice clothes and nice things. And it just wasn't what the community needed at the time. So, and we've kind of said that all here, but donating right is so important. Donating to the organizations that you trust, that you know have a presence in that particular community, that you know has as a means to provide services inside that community. That's what's really important. And we've experienced it. Sandy Hook, semis of teddy bears. I mean, so that goes on and on and on. We got bowling balls, skates, all kinds of stuff for the people coming in from Haiti after the earthquake, and they didn't need winter jackets in Florida, and they didn't need bowling balls. So, but that's what happens, unfortunately. Well-meaning people, but it's the disaster within the disaster.
It is, and it's beautiful when people are. So sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to feed off of Alan. It's beautiful to see the generosity of our people, right? And in our communities, and they want to give. And it's a beautiful sight to see, children at the school, in the classroom, collect all these canned goods or donations of clothing and what have you. And then they come up to our door here at the Red Cross. And it breaks my heart to have to say, that's beautiful, right? Let's make some calls to see where we can get this to, because, we are unable to accept it. So definitely, I think, it'd be great if in some of our interviews that we have with the media and in our conversations with some of our partners and so forth is have a conversation. talk to whoever it is that you're wanting to donate to and find out what is needed or what the process is. And it saves a lot of time and heartache, because let me tell you, it breaks my heart to have to, steer them in another direction.
After the Puerto Rico hurricanes a couple of years ago, we funded actual journeys from the port into Puerto Rico to get things to people who needed. Stuff that showed up there was amazing. Blankets and coats and things that people paid money to ship in containers there that were of absolutely no use to them. So I think you're right, though. In that moment after something happens, people just want to give. They just want to do something, and they'll grab whatever they've got to give. So that communication from the media would be good. Anything else the media shouldn't do?
Yeah, I have two quick things I would add. I mean, I definitely agree. Cash is king. Like, it's nimble, it's agile, it changes shape as it arrives. So be responsive to the community. It's just amazing. I would say two things media should maybe frame it a bit more positively, but I mean, I'd love us to stop doing disaster porn. I'd really like us to have stories that show the dignity of our communities, that empower them, that show that they themselves they're their first responders. They are their own first responders. And we don't tell that story enough. We don't show that story enough. We victimize populations. And that's partly what drives this, like, let me give mindset in terms of things, because we're not lifting people up. So I'd love to see the media doing more stories that really tell that, because it also will help us frame that recovery needs, because we see them as partners in that. The second thing I would say is stop pressuring the response. There's so much attentiveness of like, look, American Red Cross hasn't done X and it's been 5 hours. Where are they? Well, you can't have, we're listening to the community, we're trying to be responsive to the community, and by the way, why aren't you doing something yesterday? I think we need to give a little bit of grace to the organizations that are in the response, give them time to work with communities, and that's going to require the media to kind of, again, pull back a bit, tell a different story, talk about how, yes, we found all these people on the ground in the field speaking with these communities, and they're working on responses, they're working on recovery that community wants, and really highlighting that versus trying to say, here we are, we found someone who's unhappy, and here's the narrative they have for that. Because it's not positive. And again, it not only does it, so one is disempowering the populations, the second is disempowering the organizations who are entrusted by those populations to help them. And I'd like for media to lift us all up a little bit better. And I think we'll see better recovery as a result of it.
Like it. That's good. Nicole is joining us again because we have some questions from the audience that she'll share with you. Nicole?
Yeah, I know we're going to be starting to run out of time, and just wanted to bring up a couple of the questions that arrived. I know this was sort of addressed a little bit earlier in terms of some of the smaller organizations, the smaller nonprofits, and I think there's this tug and pull in terms of, what you see is a lot of the larger, more maybe well-known or established nonprofits receiving a lot of investment through philanthropy to help, provide response or even some of that long-term recovery or preparedness. And yet for some of the smaller nonprofit organizations that may be highly and deeply interwoven into some of the affected communities may have some challenges to accessing some of that philanthropy. Do you have any thoughts in terms of how that might be better bridged? And I know for some of the organizations represented on here too, you kind of are playing some of that role. Can you just touch on that a little bit?
I would add to that something I was thinking about a while ago, but didn't say. In all of our disaster funds, whether it's gun violence or climate, there's always a nonprofit portfolio, because you don't think about this, but a storm comes through and knocks out a bunch of human services nonprofits that now can't support the communities that depend on them. And they sometimes are at the end of Alan's long list at FEMA, right? He said they never make you whole. They sometimes get to the other end of that with no insurance and nothing. So the ability to support nonprofits so they can go back to work, doing the things that they would typically be doing in a community that they're knocked out just like everybody else is, that's an important component.
I think just to add to that, it really is about being a sustainable donor to those community organizations. You know who they are, you support them already, you're aware of them if you are, become a regular donor to them, build a relationship with them. Blue sky times are the time to really identify who you want to work with. And I talked about strategy. Strategy is not just something corporations and foundations have. You can have a family strategy. You can have clarity. What are the issues? What are the values that align with your own family? What are the organizations whose missions speak to you? And set up regular giving. And that way they will be able to actually be there for that community when the crisis happens. And they'll probably, be able to make an appeal to you for what they are willing to do or able to do in that longer term after a disaster strikes. It's yes, the large organizations, they're machines, they're able to put out those requests very quickly, but it's on us whether we choose them or not, right? It's on us on whether we're responsive to that or whether we're proactive about who will we want to help, how will we look like. And maybe, like for me, I'm a balance. I do both international, large, big national, and then I have some community-based organizations here in Washington, D.C. And for me, that's because I have, my values are widespreading in terms of my areas of interest and concern for my family. But that doesn't mean everyone is. Some people may be entirely local, right? So those are things that, yes, find them, look at them, work on them. And if that's really an area you're committed to and you're a large organization and you don't know how to find them, again, seek out intermediaries that are willing to do that for you, that connect for you and are able to take that approach, that long-term recovery approach, community-led. And we've heard from a few folks today about what those are, who those are, and how you can help them.
Another question that came in is, what about the opposite of donor fatigue? I know we hit on donor fatigue. So how do you find a balance between those who are giving endlessly versus what your actual needs are and your ability to manage those donated resources? And is there ever a tipping point too, in terms of, I know Janice too, you hit on some of the restricted funding too, that doesn't give you as much flexibility. But there may be an appearance too in terms of allocating a lot of resources to disaster and how much can organizations help to manage that. I don't know if that's something that anybody's experiencing or if you've seen, or even Patty from where you sit with a broader perspective of that happening.
You don't hear many people complaining that they have too many funds. And I don't mean that with any facetiousness. I think it is a reality. There are, yes, examples of where the funding and the response has been overwhelming. And there's also examples of organizations giving money back in those cases. MSF, Doctors Without Borders during the tsunami in 2004 comes to mind. The generosity was so great, they actually stopped receiving funds and returned some funds that were specific to that crisis, right? That were donor intent. They asked, would you like to give somewhere else in the world? As Janice said, like, trust the organization to be able to allocate it somewhere else. If the capacity is too much in that location, I guarantee you there's needs in another place where they're working that they could send those funds. Or if they are able to be flexible, they may be able to give it to a partner organization. We've received funding from grantee partners at times, people who've gotten too much money or they're not responding in a certain area, and they donate it to CDP for us to give out somewhere else. And that's from someone who we normally give money to. So I think there is a lot of established routes for that if you give them the flexibility to do it. And again, that goes to who's the organization you've chosen. Do you trust them? Have you researched them? And if they are that kind of organization, I wouldn't have any hesitancy about giving money in a flexible way to them to allow them to make the decisions on where that funding needs to go.
Great. Thanks, Patty. I know we covered a lot today, and I know we're at about time. So thank you all for your wonderful insights and input. At the beginning, I had mentioned Table Talk 2. I will give another plug. I know we put in a link to that. And something just to add to note with that is we talked about community resilience and communities that are high in civic engagement, communities where people know each other and are there and can be there for each other is important in terms of responding to times of disaster. And so we'd love to have more people be able to be around the table and a part of that conversation. So thank you again for today and for everyone joining the call. And we look forward to our next conversation of the role in philanthropy.